are doing. So, generational comparison. See, this is not something that I particularly do way too much, mainly because by the time the new phone shows up, I've usually sold the last one. But the fact is this time I held around. Especially with the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, I had a feeling that this would be particularly interesting, and I'd say personally that it is. The findings are intriguing to say the least, but of course, you guys are the judge of that. However, what I can tell you is that the Xiaomi 15 Ultra, what I'm expecting more than anything else, is that we'll not only see hardware changes and so on because they exist, but also software refinements. That's something that the 14 Ultra was always lacking. Inconsistency was kind of the name of the game if you think about it. It's a good camera, but inconsistent. That can often be the bane of the existence for a lot of Xiaomi devices. I'm hoping that at least to an extent, it has been improved. And so bearing that in mind, let's start off with our color profiles. Now at Leica Vibrant, I'd say that there are actually some very interesting changes. I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing because, in a way, for me personally, because I like high contrast, Leica Vibrant with the Xiaomi 15 Ultra actually has way higher contrast, as you can probably tell. It looks a lot more enticing to me personally. But in case you don't like high contrast and you want a flatter result, then actually the Xiaomi 14 Ultra's lower contrast Leica Vibrant is, theoretically speaking, a better option because Leica Authentic already gives you insane levels of contrast, as you can see here. And so because of that, since we already have Leica Authentic for maximizing contrast and also giving you fairly natural looking colors, having the opposing option present, well, it kind of made sense on the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. I'm not sure how people will feel about the 15 Ultra, especially those who don't want to use Leica Authentic. But speaking of Leica Authentic, actually, you'll notice that we have slightly higher saturation present on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra. In most cases, I've noticed that it actually produces far better results. Even white balance has improved quite a bit. The accuracy of the warmth in many images, as you'll see soon enough, is gotten a lot better. So we are already seeing refinements. However, when it comes to dynamic range, you see things are a little bit more interesting because I noticed in some of the comments that we should apparently be using the Pro mode with Ultra RAW enabled, and that apparently gives us better dynamic range. So that's exactly what I tried to test out on both phones. And look, I don't know what results anyone else has gotten, but these are the results I have for you. And I've taken more than enough samples to be sure that there's no inconsistencies. And the fact is this, no matter which one you use, whether it's regular photo mode or Pro RAW, or rather Pro mode Ultra RAW, well, the results are pretty much exactly the same, which is not a bad thing to be honest, because the Xiaomi 15 Ultra already has fairly usable dynamic range. It's not the best out there. There's definitely phones that process dynamic range way better. That can be up to you if you prefer the more natural, almost un-HDR-esque look that we have. That's the best way I can term it. Now with the ultra-wide camera, things are actually just as interesting because we not only get slightly better colors with Leica Authentic on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra, I do prefer that a lot, but you'll also notice that the Xiaomi 14 Ultra actually has a wider field of view. I'm honestly kind of sad that we don't get that proper ultra wide field of view with the ultra wide camera on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra anymore. It is still one of the widest cameras that we have available right now in 2025 at least, but well, I'll miss the Xiaomi 14 Ultra's true ultra wide. Unfortunate that we had to let that go. And in some of these cases, you'll notice that the warmth in the scene is much more prominent, much more present on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra. That is exactly how it looked. I'd know since I took those photos. The Xiaomi 14 Ultra always had a tendency to not only desaturate a little bit too much sometimes, but also neutralize warmth. It seems that Xiaomi has aimed to fix both of those issues at once by increasing the bit of saturation, especially with Leica Authentic, and also ensuring that the color accuracy and the accuracy of the warm tones are maintained properly. That's a huge deal. And then of course with our backlit shots, I think it's once again pretty obvious that the Xiaomi 15 Ultra has a general tendency to give you a little bit more detail. We saw this at the main camera as well, but it'll give you a little bit more detail in the shadows and the overall method with which the exposure and the balancing is handled in the given scene for any such high contrast, high dynamic range situation. I'd say it's actually gotten a lot better on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra. But once again, using the Ultra RAW with Pro mode, it gave me no different results. It's exactly the same as the regular photos that I took. Then of course, the macro situation. This is actually almost exactly the same on both phones, which is to say that it's a middle of the road macro. You can't exactly get too close. You don't really have sensor crop options. It's nice that it's a periscope macro. It works far better than the ultra wide macros in my personal opinion. But the fact is this, you're probably noticing that the colors, oh man, those colors look beautiful on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra. The 14 Ultra, look, generally it doesn't desaturate this much, but this is you can see the inconsistencies that we tend to face, right? This is particularly egregious in this particular comparison. I'm not sure why that's the case, but I am noticing a lot of issues and inconsistencies that are just taken care of on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra, which is a very good sign. That's exactly how upgrades should be. Now, speaking of upgrades, let's take a look at zoom. I am hoping for one thing, that the Xiaomi 15 Ultra adds just a pinch of sharpening when it especially does zoom shots, because usually Xiaomi has a tendency to just omit sharpening through and through. There's a very fine balance, and I'm hoping that Xiaomi has fixed that. But of course, cropping in and looking at the 2x sensor crop adds, not really. If anything, they have actually lowered the sharpening amount. Now, outside of just not having any sharpening at all this time, like 0% sharpening as opposed to maybe like the 5% that we have on the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, I'm also noticing a bit of motion blur. That could be because I didn't exactly take these in broad daylight. I wanted to stress these cameras, stress the zoom and the high-res shots as much as possible to really bring out any differences. But appear that instead of showing how the 15 Ultra has improved on these things, we actually have a bit of a problem with motion blur. But then with the 3x, now in general 3x has always been, once again, a bit of a middle of the road telephoto camera. It's not the best out there, it's not the worst, it really is middle of the pack. But I'm hoping that Xiaomi has improved on it at least a little bit. And well, would you look at that? Most definitely the Xiaomi 15 Ultra's 3x, at least with 12 megapixels, it is producing significantly more detail. This is a huge difference, and to be honest, I didn't really expect this. I kind of expected the 2x to be better, or maybe like, the high-res segments to be better. But to see that the 3x is producing such better results, and I'm guessing this is mostly because of software processing improvements, well, it's a good sign. Now, speaking of good signs, we actually have a brand new 4.3x 200 megapixel sensor. Now, this is 12 megapixels, obviously, but I'm hoping that with the new sensor, we might actually see some improved detail preservation. And once again, we have motion blur issues. Now, this is exactly why I took these shots in slightly less than ideal conditions, because otherwise it's impossible to pinpoint these problems. And I would say that the 14 Ultra is able to handle these situations a lot better, as you can probably tell. 15 Ultra, which I know has a lot more detail in general, as opposed to the 14 Ultra's 5x, well, because of the motion blur problems, it's not really able to showcase it. Now that high resolution, starting off with the main camera, and honestly, I'm not expecting a lot of differences here. This is supposed to be fairly similar. And well, I would say it pretty much is. Now, there is way higher contrast on the 15 Ultra, which is why some of the details in the shadows are kind of being crushed. Now, overall, the image looks fine, but especially when you zoom in on an area which has a lot of shadows, you can tell that the shadows are being dropped down, to say the least. Now, in general, the detail preservation is pretty much the same, with maybe a pinch less sharpening artifacts on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra. It's a very minor difference. But then, of course, the ultra-wide camera, and once again, you can just clearly see that the Xiaomi 15 Ultra is able to maintain the warmth in the scene so much better than the 14 Ultra. Yes, the warm lights were really that saturated and the warmth was really that prevalent in this particular scene when I took this shot. Even with high resolution, where we don't have like authentic or vibrant, the Xiaomi 14 Ultra is just not able to handle that situation, and it just neutralizes all of the warmth. Well, most of it. So that is nice and all, but the fact is, when we crop in all the way to 500%, there's a very drastic difference in the amount of detail that's being brought out. And I say brought out for a very good reason, because the Xiaomi 14 Ultra is actually sharpening, and that little bit of sharpening is really close to that fine point of balance where the sharpening is present and is bringing out details, but it doesn't look over sharpened. But because the 15 Ultra has no sharpening whatsoever, it doesn't look nearly as nice as it could be. So that is kind of unfortunate. But then with 3x, I would quite easily say that the 15 Ultra has a little bit of desaturation going on. Like the greens look much better on the 14 Ultra this time around. I do like the high contrast on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra, but the colors are way nicer on the 14. But of course, we are here for the details, and guess what? Very similar to the 12 megapixel shots, the 15 Ultra actually has a lot more detail happening. And there's also slightly less grain as opposed to the 14 Ultra. Now, I don't know how much of the grain you can see after YouTube compression, but trust me, there's definitely some amount there on the 14 Ultra. It's a minor difference and way less of a difference as opposed to the 12 megapixel shots that we saw. But the 15 Ultra does seem to have genuinely improved upon its 3x, which again, I really did not expect. But what I am expecting more than anything else is that the 4.3x brand new periscope zoom that we have, it improves upon details drastically as opposed to what we had previously. Not to say that the Xiaomi 14 Ultra was bad or anything, but I mean, it's a brand new sensor that we have. I'm expecting improvements. And well, with the 50 megapixel bin down version, I'd say it's about 100 times better as opposed to the 14 Ultra. Now once again, these are not in ideal conditions, so that could be why the 14 Ultra is suffering, but at the end of the day, the lighting is the same across the board for both phones and the 15 Ultra is miles ahead. That's a good thing. This is once again one of those things that you expect. Now following that, of course, we have the 200 megapixel mode. You might be thinking, if you haven't seen any of my previous comparisons, is that the 15 Ultra's 50 megapixel mode looked tremendous. It was stunning. So obviously the 200 megapixel mode must be balls to the walls crazy, right? That is not exactly accurate because, as you can probably tell, yeah, it kind of lowered the sharpening, but I also feel like it has a lot more smudging happening on the 15 Ultra. The fact is this, not just as per this comparison, as per all of the other ones that I've already done with the Xiaomi 15 Ultra, I can confidently tell you that the Xiaomi 15 Ultra's 200 megapixel mode with the 4.3x periscope zoom is not worth using. The 50 megapixel mode is good. It's a huge upgrade as opposed to what we had previously, and that's fantastic and all, but the 200 megapixel mode is really, it's basically worthless as far as I can tell. It gives no worthwhile results, no matter what the lighting condition might be. Now, another area where we have had once again some refinements is the selfie department, because it's mostly balancing changes in terms of how the contrast is handled to ensure that details, especially details in the shadows on your face and whatnot, are not completely crushed, and also skin tones. I have noticed that the Xiaomi 14 Ultra had always had a tendency to just desaturate skin tones a little too much, for my personal taste at least. And I think the 15 Ultra kind of improves on that just enough to the point that it doesn't look oversaturated, but it also looks like there's some juice in the skin, to say the least. But look, outside of that, to be entirely honest, both of these phones have really good selfies, and the 14 Ultra selfies may look a little desaturated to some, maybe perfect to others. I don't know, that's up to you. But I would never say that it's a bad selfie camera. The selfies actually do turn out fairly alright. 15 Ultra, in my personal opinion, is much better. However, in my personal opinion, I think that when it comes to human subjects, it's the portrait mode that is the most important. And in that regard, yes, the overall framework of the portrait mode is the same. We have the good old-fashioned master portraits and Leica portraits. You can choose whichever one you want. Personally, obviously, I prefer Leica portraits because I like high contrast. That's really the major difference. Master portraits will give you slightly lower contrast, slightly smoother roll-offs, so on and so forth, while Leica portraits will jack up the contrast to high heaven, and, well, I'm all for it. But as you can probably tell, the issue with the Xiaomi 14 Ultra is that its balancing with the contrast and the exposure and everything involved is not good enough, not nearly as good as the Xiaomi 15 Ultra. And that is where I feel we once again have a huge upgrade, and most of this actually has to do with the way images are processed, because these upgrades, this refinement in balancing, it's across the board. And I also know for a fact that the 14 Ultra can produce really good portraits, really well balanced portraits, because in this backlit portrait, it's basically perfect. So is the 15 Ultra. But in all the other ones, as you can probably tell, whether it's the 35mm or the 75 and so on, it kind of struggles. Its contrast is not nearly as well balanced as you would hope for it to be, especially given the fact that these were under very good lighting conditions. I shot these in normal daylight, so the fact that you're not getting good results and that there is inconsistency, it's a bit of a problem. The Xiaomi 15 Ultra in that regard is much better. Now, is the 15 Ultra completely free of inconsistency? Not really, of course, because with this 100mm shot, as you can probably tell, all the highlights in my face are blown out on both phones. So inconsistencies are still present. It's still more so than some of the other competition that we have here. But to be honest, it's a genuine upgrade and I'm all for it. And now finally we have night mode. Now the UI for the night mode is actually gone on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra. As weird as that sounds, that is actually the case. We can just use night mode now with the regular photo mode. Now initially I was very uncomfortable and I really just wanted to scroll to night mode every time I took out the Xiaomi 15 Ultra, but over time it's just been made very clear to me that the 15 Ultra's processing and the way it can just bring out details at nighttime and in low light situations, the way it can identify and basically switch to long exposures easily, there's nothing to be worried about. There's no issue whatsoever. Over the course of quite a few days and 3 separate camera comparisons that I've shot, not once have I had a problem with night mode. It's been basically perfect and easily my favorite night mode that I have right now. Now a huge part of that is obviously the fact that we get Leica authentic and some of the most natural and realistic looking night mode shots known to mankind. But yeah, the fact is it works really well and it is more streamlined than it ever could have been, which is a big deal, I guess. And of course, we have our main camera ultra low light. Now, one thing to bear in mind before we zoom in is that the 15 Ultra actually took a second less with the long exposure as opposed to the 14 Ultra. And bearing that in mind, this is fairly impressive. Yes, in a way, the 14 Ultra has less grain, but the amount of detail that is being brought out by the 15 Ultra with a smaller exposure time, that's impressive to say the least. And well, I'm sure that it doesn't surprise you that the ultra wide situation is one and the same. We still get fantastic night mode across both phones, to be entirely honest. But the only benefit on the 15 Ultra at this point is that you can just point and shoot with regular photo mode. You don't have to go to night mode. And that maybe can help you with less of a hassle, I guess. But the overall quality is stunning on both, and I honestly don't have anything to complain about here. Both of these phones, in my opinion, produce some of the best night mode that you could ever hope for. Plain and simple. And then lastly, for the ultra wide camera, we of course have the ultra wide, ultra low light. A lot of ultras, but cropping all the way in, it's very obvious that the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, yes, it has similar levels of detail, but the amount of artifacting and the sharpening artifacts and the noise reduction artifacts that we have all over the place is very significant, as opposed to the 15 Ultra, which just produces a generally more refined image, which is, again, exactly something that you expect from a generational upgrade. Now, last but not least, we have zoom, starting off as usual with a 2x sensor crop. And cropping all the way in, the differences are minor, to say the least, because it would appear that the 15 Ultra has a little bit more sharpening and a little bit more noise reduction. And it's kind of the opposite on the 14 Ultra. So it just looks a little bit more processed, I guess, on the 15 Ultra, while it looks a little bit more noisy, and I do see some amounts of noise reduction artifacts in there as well on the 14. So it's not a big difference, to say the least, and it's not going to blow you away. But then the 3x. Now 3x is going to be interesting because we have seen some genuine upgrades with the 15 Ultra. It is, again, a shadow upgrade that's not something I expected to really see, but it is very nice to see that we have upgrades, and well, it carries through with night mode because, man, it is so much nicer, so much cleaner on the 15 Ultra as opposed to the 14 Ultra, which clearly is struggling. Now then, the periscope zoom situation. So we have had some ups and downs with the 4.3x periscope on the 15 Ultra. With regular 12 megapixels, it had a lot of motion blur. With the 50 megapixel mode, it blew the 14 Ultra away. And then the 200 megapixel mode, just as I expected at least, it really didn't do anything, almost, because that's just the way it is. How about night mode? Well, as you can plainly see, the 15 Ultra does seem to have some motion blur happening again. It doesn't really surprise me that it has that issue, but it is still producing way better contrast and way better detail. It's also a little bit cleaner with the grain, and the artifacting is far less as opposed to the 14 Ultra. So yes, all in all, it is producing a better result. And so that brings us to the end of this beautiful comparison. I must say, I'm very glad I kept the 14 Ultra around for this particular comparison. There's definitely a lot of things that I've upgraded here. So the 15 Ultra is something I would say a genuine classic generational upgrade. This is how every phone should be upgrading their cameras, their phones in general, through the generations. It doesn't happen nearly as often as you might hope. We have had many devices, even in 2025, that have these weird downgrades that make no sense, whether it's in the hardware or the software not being as refined and so on and so forth. That's not the case here, thankfully. The Xiaomi 15 Ultra, I would say Xiaomi has done something that is genuinely expected from most manufacturers, but honestly, this is very nice to see. And I do hope that many other phones do the same. Not to say that the 15 Ultra is the best camera out there or anything as such, I'm just saying that this is a path that other smartphones should take as well. Other smartphone manufacturers should just follow this model, to say the least. And well, with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed, found this helpful, because I sure as hell did. I didn't expect the 3x to be as good, at least. And well, I'll see you guys enough with more. Cheers.